When Hurricane Harvey tore through the Texas coast, it left nothing but wreckage behind. Sarah ended up stuck in a town she barely knew, surrounded by strangers trying to piece their lives back together. That's when Rusty showed up, a wild bobcat the locals recognized, even though no one really owned him. He had vanished when the storm rolled in. But one morning, there he was again, dragging something strange through the debris. In his strong jaws, he carried a weathered burlap sack, heavy enough that he had to stop and rest every few steps. Whatever was inside, it meant enough for this wild animal to walk straight into human territory, risking everything just to deliver it. But what exactly was he carrying? Based on a true story, this is about survival, unexpected friendship, and the quiet moments that connect us all. Before we dive in, tap that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. The rain had finally stopped. After 3 long days of Harvey pounding the coast, the sky over Sinton, Texas, turned a pale, washed-out blue. Sarah Miller stood quietly on her front porch, looking out at the mess left behind in her new neighborhood. Water still pooled in the streets, and pieces of broken lives, branches, roof shingles, even kids' toys, were scattered everywhere. She had only been living here for 2 months. Now her so-called fresh start had been hit by one of the worst hurricanes in state history. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter. The air had an odd chill for late August, like the storm had blown summer right out of the air. Her little rental house sat on slightly higher ground than most, which had spared her from the worst of the flooding. But the power was still out, her phone barely had a signal, and the quiet around her felt almost too loud. That lonely stillness after a disaster, when everything familiar feels a little off. She was about to go back inside when she noticed something. Just a flicker of movement on the street. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. But no, something was definitely walking along the edge of the road, low and sleek. Her breath caught when she realized what it was. A bobcat strolling down Cypress Lane in plain daylight. She froze, clutching the railing of the porch. The animal wasn't massive, maybe double the size of a regular house cat, but it moved with strength and purpose, its spotted coat standing out even in the mess. What really stopped Sarah cold, though, was what the bobcat had in its mouth. It was carrying a bag. Not just any bag, a stained burlap sack, clearly heavy, dragging along the wet pavement as the animal hauled it forward. Her first thought was fear. Was the storm pushing wild animals into town? Should she go inside and lock the door? But something about the way this bobcat moved made her pause. It wasn't darting or acting spooked. It moved like it had a job to do, like it knew exactly where it was going. Curiosity won out over caution. Sarah stepped off the porch, keeping her distance, and began to follow. The bobcat didn't seem to care. It kept trudging forward at the same steady pace, never even glancing back. As she followed, Sarah noticed more details. The bag was definitely old and weather-beaten, and something large was inside. The bobcat kept stopping to adjust its grip, but it never let go completely. Each time it paused, Sarah stopped too, holding her breath until it started moving again. They passed block after block of battered houses. Not many people were outside. Most had either left before the storm or were still dealing with the damage. A few faces peered out from windows or porches, and surprisingly, no one looked alarmed. One older man gave Sarah a wave and called out, "Looks like Rusty made it through all right." Rusty? She blinked. This bobcat had a name? She hurried to catch up with the man and ask what he meant, but before she could, the bobcat turned up a cracked driveway leading to a small, beat-up ranch house. A massive oak had come down in the front yard, just missing the house. Parts of the roof were covered with blue tarps, and water stains streaked the walls. The bobcat didn't hesitate. It walked straight to the side door, dropped the sack with what sounded almost like a sigh, and sat back on its haunches. Then it let out a noise. Not a growl, not a hiss, but a sharp bird-like chirp that echoed in the quiet. Sarah stopped at the edge of the yard, unsure if she should keep going. But then the door creaked open, and an elderly man slowly peeked out. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, his voice rough but kind. "You came back, and you brought supplies." Then he looked up and spotted Sarah standing awkwardly at the edge of his yard. "And you brought company, too, I see." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "I'm sorry for intruding," she called out. I saw the Bobcat with the bag and couldn't help following. I was worried he might be hurt." The man chuckled, bending slowly to pick up the burlap sack. "No trouble at all. Why don't you come up here to the porch? I bet you've got questions, and I wouldn't mind the company. Name's George Parker." Sarah stepped forward carefully, still watching the Bobcat, who had now started rubbing his head against George's leg, just like a regular house cat. "I'm Sarah Miller," she said, stopping at the bottom step. "I moved here right before summer. I live over on Cypress, a few blocks back." "Welcome to Sinton," George said with a small smile. "Though I wish it were under better circumstances." He gave the Bobcat a gentle nudge with his boot. "This here's Rusty. Don't worry, he won't bother you. He might have been born wild, but he's been around people all his life. Acts more like a house cat than a bobcat most days." As if to prove it, Rusty flopped down and lazily started grooming his front paw, completely unfazed by Sarah standing nearby. "Care for some coffee?" George asked. "It's instant, I'm afraid. No power for the real stuff." Sarah hesitated just a moment, then nodded. There was something in George's weathered face and calm tone that made her feel safe. After days alone during the storm, any human connection felt like something precious. Inside, George's house was tidy, but showed signs that he'd been getting ready for the storm. Furniture was pulled toward the middle of the room, away from the windows. Bins were stacked near the walls, probably full of important papers or photo albums. A battery lantern sat on the kitchen counter, throwing a soft yellow glow. George set the sack down and opened it. Sarah leaned in and saw some packets of jerky, a couple cans of tuna, and a bag of what looked like dry pet food. George muttered, shaking his head. "Rusty must have raided my emergency stash in the shed out back. Must have busted in there when the storm hit." He looked down at the Bobcat, who had padded over and now sat by a dish in the kitchen corner, watching them expectantly. "Smart old boy," George said, reaching for a water bottle. "Knew we'd need food, didn't you?" As he started boiling water for coffee on a small camping stove, George began sharing Rusty's story. "It was about 7 years ago now," he said, spooning instant coffee into mugs. "After another bad storm, not like Harvey, but still pretty rough. I was walking the property line when I spotted this tiny bobcat kitten, maybe a few weeks old, caught in some debris, soaking wet, eyes barely open. Mama was nowhere in sight." He poured hot water into the mugs, his voice softening. "I should have called animal control, I know, but I'd just lost my wife a few months before. And something about that little guy, I don't know, I couldn't leave him out there." Sarah smiled as he handed her a steaming mug. She could already guess where this was going. "So you brought him home?" she said. "Just temporarily," George chuckled. "Fed him with a bottle, nursed him back. When he was eating solid food, I built a pen for him out back. Figured I'd let him go once he was strong enough." He moved toward the living room, and Sarah followed. She took a seat on the couch while George settled into a faded recliner. Rusty circled the room once before curling up near George's feet. "Then my son and his family moved in," George continued. "Tom had lost his job, and they needed a place to stay. Their boy Jake was just a baby then, barely a year old. But he and Rusty connected instantly, like they were meant for each other." Sarah took a sip of coffee, warming her hands on the mug. "So Rusty stayed," she said. "He made sure of that," George replied with a smile. We tried to keep things normal, no treating him like a pet, no letting him in the house. But Rusty had other plans. He figured out how to open the latch on the enclosure, started sneaking inside. He'd follow Jake around the yard like a watchdog. By the time Jake turned 3, we knew Rusty wasn't going anywhere. "Is that even legal?" Sarah asked, eyebrows raised. George gave a half shrug. "Technically, probably not. But out here, people look the other way. We're rural enough that no one makes a fuss. Rusty hunts on his own, keeps his instincts sharp, but he always comes back, especially to see Jake." His smile faded a little. "That's why I didn't evacuate when the storm came. Tom and his wife took Jake to San Antonio, but someone had to stay for Rusty." Sarah looked down, her voice quiet. "That must have been terrifying." George nodded slowly. "Worst storm I've ever seen," he said. "When the eye wall passed through, it sounded like a freight train screaming through the house. Part of the roof tore off. That's what the tarps are covering. Rusty was inside with me when it happened. The crash scared him half to death. He bolted straight out a broken window, and I hadn't seen him since, until today." As they sat together, Sarah started to learn more about George's family. His son Tom worked construction, but had struggled to find steady work since the oil industry slowed down. His wife Melissa was a nurse at the county hospital. And little Jake, just 6 years old, was, according to his grandpa, the spitting image of George's late wife, with a heart twice as big. The conversation flowed easily as the sun dipped lower, casting soft shadows across the floor. George brought out some old photos. One showed Jake as a toddler, with Rusty curled protectively beside him. Another had Rusty perched on the porch railing, keeping a watchful eye on birds. And one from last fall, with Jake getting on the school bus for the first time. Rusty sitting back in the distance, watching him go. "Everyone around here knows about him," George said. "Most folks keep their distance, which is how it should be. He's still wild, and he can defend himself if he needs to. But he's never hurt anyone. If anything, he acts like the local watchman." A memory clicked for Sarah. "Is that why Mrs. Dennings has a 'Beware of Bobcat' sign in her yard? I thought that was a joke." George laughed, a deep rolling chuckle that made Rusty's ears twitch. "Edith's got a sharp sense of humor, but I'll tell you what, that sign has kept more than one salesman off her porch." As they talked, Sarah noticed herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since the storm warnings began. There was something steady and grounding about George's quiet presence, and something remarkable about the bond between this man and the wild cat dozing by his feet. In the middle of so much destruction, this unlikely friendship felt like a reminder that not everything beautiful had been swept away. As the light began to fade, Sarah stood reluctantly. "I should get going before it gets dark," she said. "The roads are still messy, and I don't have a flashlight." George nodded and pushed himself up from his chair. "I appreciate the company," he said. "It gets mighty quiet around here without the family. They'll come back once the road's clear, but for now, it's just me and this rascal." He nudged Rusty gently with his foot, and the bobcat let out a soft chirp of protest. "Do you need anything?" Sarah asked. "I've got some extra canned goods at home." "We're set now, thanks to Rusty's scavenging skills," George said with a small smile. "But I wouldn't say no to a visit tomorrow if you're up for it. Jake would be thrilled to know someone followed Rusty all the way home. Not many folks would have had the nerve." Sarah promised she'd come back and made her way through the damp, cluttered streets, her steps lighter than they'd been in days. The visit had stirred something inside her, a feeling of connection she hadn't expected to find in the aftermath of a hurricane. And true to her word, she came back the next day. And the next. She helped George clear debris from the yard, and together they secured the tarps on the roof more tightly. Rusty came and went, often bringing little offerings. Once it was a freshly caught rabbit. George quietly got rid of it while Rusty wasn't looking. Another time, it was a tattered child's toy, damp and muddy, but offered with clear purpose. On the fourth day after the storm, Sarah and George were sipping their usual instant coffee on the porch when a mud-splattered pickup truck pulled into the driveway. The back door opened before the engine had even shut off, and a young boy with messy brown hair came flying out. "Grandpa! Rusty!" he shouted, racing toward the house. Rusty, who'd been lounging in a warm spot near the steps, sprang up at the sound. He let out a happy chirp and bounded to meet the boy, circling him with an energy Sarah hadn't seen before. Jake skidded to a stop, beaming. "You're okay? I told Mom and Dad you'd be okay." He looked up at the porch where George stood motionless, eyes glistening. "Grandpa!" The reunion that followed tugged hard at Sarah's heart. Tom and Melissa stepped out of the truck and wrapped George in a tight, tearful hug, the kind that only comes after days of worry and silence. Jake babbled about their time in San Antonio, about the hotel and the big trucks clearing roads. Rusty weaved through their legs, sometimes stopping to sit and watch them, like he was making sure everything was right again. Melissa, a small woman with the same brown hair as Jake, spotted Sarah hanging back a bit. She walked up and offered her hand. "You must be the neighbor Dad told us about. Thank you for checking on him. We were going out of our minds until cell service came back yesterday." "Sarah's been a godsend," George said from the porch, glancing her way. "She was here when Rusty came back, with supplies no less." Tom chuckled and ruffled Jake's hair. "This kid never stopped believing Rusty would take care of Grandpa. Looks like he was right." As the family caught up, Sarah began to step back, feeling like she'd already lingered too long during such a personal reunion. But Jake had other plans. "Are you coming to the neighborhood cookout?" he asked, tugging gently at her sleeve. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Cookout?" "It's sort of a tradition after storms," Melissa explained with a smile. "Once the road's clear enough, everyone brings whatever food might spoil without power, and we have a big community barbecue. It'll be at the elementary school field this evening." She gave Sarah a warm, welcoming look. "You should come. It's a good way to meet everyone, under better circumstances than usual." The cookout was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced in her old life back in Houston. Maybe it was the storm's aftermath, or maybe it was just the town itself, but the people of Sinton showed up with a kind of spirit she hadn't expected. Grills were lined up across the school's concrete basketball court. Tables, pulled from the cafeteria, were packed with thawing foods: hot dogs, hamburger meat, potato salad, coleslaw, and even a few melting gallons of ice cream. Kids chased each other across the field, their laughter cutting through the still-present scent of floodwater and smoke. Adults stood in clusters, swapping storm stories and offers to help each other rebuild. Sarah moved through the crowd a little timidly at first, but George made a point to introduce her to everyone as the brave lady who followed Rusty home. To her surprise, that made her something of a local celebrity. "You actually followed him?" asked Mrs. Dennings, the woman with the "Beware of Bobcat" sign. "Most newcomers run the other way." "I was curious," Sarah admitted with a laugh. "He just seemed like he had somewhere to be." "That's Rusty," said another neighbor, who introduced himself as Coach Wilson from the high school. "Smartest wild animal I've ever seen. Been watching him grow up alongside Jake. He's something else." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself feeling more at home than she had in months, maybe ever. The people here had an ease with each other, built from years of shared history and the kind of reliance that only small towns really understand. They knew each other's stories, each other's habits and hardships. And now, somehow, Sarah was part of that mix, because of George, because of Jake, and because of a half-wild bobcat who delivered food in the middle of a hurricane. The highlight of the night came just after sunset. Jake, who had disappeared for a while, came strolling across the edge of the field, Rusty right at his side. A few out-of-town relief workers gasped. "It's okay," Jake called out. "Mom said Rusty could come if he behaves, and he promised he would." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Melissa stood off to the side, watching carefully but letting her son take the lead. Rusty stayed right by Jake's side, moving calmly through the crowd and accepting bits of hamburger with quiet dignity. One of the relief workers, a young man from Dallas, came over to Sarah. "Is that really a bobcat?" he asked in a low voice. "Just hanging out at a barbecue?" Sarah nodded, a little grin pulling at her mouth. "That's Rusty. He's kind of a local legend now." "Now?" the worker asked, clearly intrigued. "Haven't you heard the story?" Sarah asked. And so she told it. The storm, the disappearance, the burlap sack dragged through the wreckage. As she spoke, she realized the story was already changing. Little details were growing, softening around the edges. "Some people say he broke into the supply shed on purpose," she said with a shrug. "That he knew George would need help and brought the food back to him. I don't know if I buy that part, but after this week?" She smiled. "I'm willing to keep an open mind." The worker just shook his head, amazed. "I've been to 5 different disaster zones," he said, "and I've never seen anything like this. Usually, folks are too overwhelmed just trying to look after their families. But here, there's something else going on." As darkness settled in, someone brought out a guitar. Music filled the air. Country songs, a few hymns, tunes people knew by heart. Sarah sat on a blanket with George, Tom, Melissa, and Jake, who was finally starting to slow down, leaning sleepily against his grandfather. Rusty lay nearby, curled up like any household pet, his eyes half closed but alert. "You know," George said quietly, looking down at Jake, "they say animals can sense storms, that they know when to hide, when to run." He paused, his voice low and thoughtful. "I think they can sense other things too." Sarah turned to him. "What do you mean?" George nodded toward Rusty, whose amber eyes caught the soft glow of the portable lights strung up around the field. "I think he knows who needs him," he said. 7 years ago, it was a lonely old man who'd lost his purpose after losing his wife. These days, it's a young boy learning about responsibility and about the wild things we share this world with. Then he looked over at Sarah. And maybe when the storm hit, it was a whole town that needed reminding that we're not so different from the wild things ourselves. We all look for shelter. We gather what we need to get through. And somehow, we all find our way home again. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Home. That word had felt so distant ever since her divorce, since she packed up what was left of a life that had slowly fallen apart and moved to Sinton in search of peace. But what she'd found, unexpectedly and gently, was something far deeper than peace. She had found belonging. As if picking up on her thoughts, Rusty slowly rose from his place and padded toward her. Just like he had on that first stormy morning, he moved with purpose. No fear, no hesitation. He settled beside her and sat quietly, close enough that she could feel the soft heat of his body pressing against her leg. "Well, I'll be," George said softly, watching with wonder. "Looks like he's chosen you, too." Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering just above Rusty's fur. He tilted his head and met her gaze, those wild amber eyes unreadable but calm. Then, with a gentle chirp, he leaned into her hand, accepting the contact. Sarah let her fingers settle on his fur, and something inside her that had been closed for too long cracked open, just enough to let the warmth in. Around them, the voices of her new neighbors rose in quiet song. The stars appeared one by one above the darkened town, and in that moment, something shifted. Sarah felt it clearly. The hurt she'd carried for so long was still there, but it no longer defined her. Just like Rusty's burlap sack, dragged through wreckage and flood, The weight she had carried held something she hadn't seen until now, something vital for her own survival. In the weeks that followed, as Hurricane Harvey became a memory and Sinton began to rebuild, the story of Rusty and the mysterious bag took on a life of its own. People shared it with awe and laughter. The sack got heavier with each retelling, its contents more magical. But Sarah would just smile when she heard it, because she knew the truth. And the truth, as it had happened, was miracle enough. That in the middle of loss and chaos, a wild bobcat had reminded an entire community of something they already knew deep down, that we are all more connected than we think, to nature, to each other, and to the places we call home.